Hello, everyone. Here we are. Welcome. Welcome, everyone, to our Shoreline Climate Champion Series. We're going to start in just a minute here. I'm very happy to have everyone with us tonight for our last session. Hope everybody had a good day. It was very nice here and enjoyed some sunshine. So I want to officially welcome everyone to our final City of Shoreline Climate Champion Series. We're thrilled that you joined us tonight, and our session this evening is communicating like a champion for the climate. So we're excited to be here and have you here with us. Just a reminder, as I mentioned, tonight is our final of our Shoreline Climate Champion Series for this year. And we're going to be welcoming Emily Moberg shortly and Autumn Salamak for our presentations. And I just wanted to share with you a little bit about how we're going to learn to effectively share our messages when we talk about climate change, and get you all ready to share what you've learned during your Climate Champion Series education. Prepare you for those family conversations coming up. Just as a general reminder, we are in webinar mode, so that means that all attendees are muted and we have your videos turned off. We are, however, monitoring the chat box, and we are also recording this session so that anyone that's not able to join us this evening would be able to watch it after it's posted tomorrow. We post all the sessions that we record on the shoreline.wa.gov/climate page. And like I mentioned, communicating like a champion for the climate speakers, we have Emily Moberg from the National Network for Ocean and Climate Change Interpretation joining us from the East Coast, and Autumn Salamak, City of Shoreline Environmental Services, joining us from the West Coast. Our presentation tonight will run till approximately 8:15, and at the end of Autumn's presentation, you'll be able to find out all the ways you can participate in moving forward. And after Emily's talk, we'll also allow some time for Q&A, so be aware of that. So what we're hoping from you, as always, is that you're engaged, you ask questions. As I mentioned, please use the chat box at the bottom of your screen to ask those questions of the presenters. And if you please be respectful and considerate of other people's opinions. If you need a break, take one. And as always, we will be sending out our final survey tomorrow with the follow-up email. There'll be one this evening if you get that link tonight and want to fill it out. We really appreciate your feedback. We're looking forward to hopefully continuing the series again next year, and the city really values your input, and especially as they're moving forward on plans. So before we introduce Emily and get her presentation started, I just wanted to do a quick poll to find out how many people are watching with you tonight. So if you just take a moment and fill that out, appreciate it. And also on the right, to the right, if you scroll down, you'll see it also shows where you're watching from. So if you can fill that out, we appreciate that as well. So that gives us a good idea of the audience tonight. Just a few more seconds. We got it, only missing a few people that haven't voted yet. Thank you. Okay. I'll go ahead and end the polling there and share the results. So 3/4 of us on our own. We have a couple folks and their pets, and and a few sharing their screen. We're thrilled to have all of you here with us. And also, once again, majority from Shoreline, our neighbors in Lake Forest Park and Edmonds and Linwood, Bothell, and other King County communities are here as well. No one from outside of Washington State except for Emily. Okay. Anyway, yeah, let's see here. I have another poll for you tonight talking about climate change. So we're curious about, have you talked with family or friends about climate change during the pandemic, and especially since you started the course? If you could just take a few seconds to answer that. And if the answer is no, don't feel bad. That's what tonight's all about, learning how to, you know, better communicate it and feel comfortable talking about it. And so that's great. We'll just wait for a few more votes here and then we'll close up the poll. All right. Thank you for that. Thank you. So just to share real quick, about 83% of you have talked to others about it. That's fabulous. And then there's about 17% that haven't yet, and that's fine too. So thank you very much for participating in those. I'm going to stop my share now so that Emily can get ready to share her screen. And while I have her on here, as I mentioned before, it can be difficult to talk about climate change, and there's ways to be productive and informative and engaging, and it requires us to find ways to do that. So that's what Emily's going to help us with tonight, is to be able to communicate messages about local climate change impacts and behavior change actions that people can take. And then, as I mentioned, Autumn will be helping us with opportunities of roles that are available with City of Shoreline and the climate action plan that they're putting together and how you can get involved in that. So Emily Moberg is the executive chair for the National Network for Ocean and Climate Change Interpretation. And Emily has worked with the organization since 2013 in roles ranging from circular design.
It's curricular. If I wrote something else, that's not true.
Oh no, curricular. Oh, good. I'm right in between needing bifocals, folks. I'm sorry about that. Anyway, curricular design to leading the network science fellows. Scientist herself, she conducted her doctoral research in the MIT Woods Hole Ocean. Oh my gosh. Oceanographic, you might have to say that, oceanographic
Institution.
Perfect, thank you. Anyway, program, and has conducted research at Yale and Rutgers on the impacts of climate change on fisheries. Emily believes that empowering scientists and science educators how to communicate about climate change is a critical component of climate action. So Emily, so glad to have you here. Thank you again.
So glad to be here. And just want to check, because the buttons moved on me. Am I sharing the presentation and not something else?
It looks good to me.
Awesome. Well, thank you all for being here, and really excited to be part of this climate series, and really honored to be capping this experience that I know you've all had together. And really hoping that for those of you who have been having conversations with others about climate change, that this presentation will give you some new tools and some new ideas and resources for how to make those conversations more productive. And for those of you who haven't had conversations about climate change, I really hope that this helps empower you and gives you some tools to maybe start those conversations. So to let you know, I do have a number of slides prepared, and I know that since we're in a webinar format, it's not really conducive to our having a conversation or discussion, but please do feel free to use the chat Okay, of learning how to actually advance the slides. Here, a colleague of mine made this slide and I couldn't resist putting it in. If you do have questions, there are a couple of natural pause points in my presentation, and I will ask Heather to let me know if there are any questions at those points. So if there is something as we're going along and you'd like clarification, please do signal that, and I will try to address those at a regular cadence as we go along. But then we'll also have a decent amount of time at the end to have you ask questions. So please do feel free to put those in the chat as we go along. So today what I'm hoping that we'll cover is first, I think depending on how you've had, how many climate conversations you've had, this may be an easy sell, but that we need to talk about climate change differently and tell a different story. I know I've definitely had the experience of having had conversations that felt really frustrating, like I was not getting across the importance of this as an issue and I wasn't mobilizing towards action. And that's really what these techniques are geared towards, is to keep us civic minded and engaged. We'll tell you a little bit about who we are as an organization. I'm sorry that all of my introductory words are mouthfuls. We call ourselves NOKI, partially to avoid that, and a little bit about what the idea of strategic framing, which is what these tools that I'm going to tell you about are collectively called, and then go through these elements of an impactful climate story, which we fundamentally believe are the baseline and foundation for a good climate conversation. And then finally wrap up with some information about where you can get more information and how you can stay connected with us. And then I think through Autumn's presentation as well, how you can stay connected with each other on these issues. Okay, so where are we today with respect to the climate conversation in the United States? We believe that in order to get to effective climate action, and I know you guys have been really learning about the science of climate change, a lot of the different types of impacts that it has on different types of communities, and also a number of the solutions for climate change. And one of those we really believe is that a productive public discourse, so that we have the type of support for policies that are actually going to move us forward on climate. And so one statistic that I always find really striking is that we actually have a majority of Americans who believe that climate change is happening right now and are somewhat concerned about it. But also a majority of Americans discuss climate change rarely or never. And there's a perception among most of us that our neighbors aren't talking about it. So it feels something very isolating, that it's an issue that we care about, but maybe no one else does. And this is a really important paradigm that we think is important to disrupt. The other piece that we think is so important about changing how we talk about climate change is, I'm sure we've all experienced many of these conversations, and ways that we hear about it are really profoundly depressing and scary. So we're often talking about climate change through a kind of crisis lens. And a lot of research indicates that when crisis or fear is used to communicate by itself, we can actually end up with a sense of disengagement and paralysis, or even a sense of, well, there's no point in doing anything because it's too big. I don't know how to engage. So there's a lot of research that indicates that hope can help promote dialogue and action around climate. And in particular, that individuals who are feeling hopeful are more likely to discuss climate change with their friends and family, support the regulation of carbon dioxide, a really critical greenhouse gas, and are more likely to report that they plan on acting on climate. More importantly, or not more importantly, equally important, discussing climate change also leads to a larger acceptance of climate science. So we know that having these dialogues occurring and that they are hopeful in tone is really critical to a lot of the endpoints in terms of action that we really care about. And so it was in this context, about 10 years ago, that NOKI was formed. We were originally funded by the National Science Foundation and anchored out of a number of national aquariums, including the New England Aquarium and Monterey Bay Aquarium. So for one affiliation on your guys' coast instead of being all East Coast for me. And our idea and purpose is really to change the national conversation around climate change. And the way that we do this is by offering trainings like this one and more in-depth trainings for a variety of audiences. So we can train enough individuals with proven communication techniques so that we can change the entire national conversation to be more positive, civic-minded, and solution-focused. And you'll see some of these elements in terms of this positivity, civic-mindedness, and solutions in the tools that I'm going to present in a little bit. So we brought together a group of climate scientists, folks like me, who are originally coming from academics or science side. We brought together a lot of educators, both from the formal and informal education sphere, as well as social scientists, to help us understand some of these mental models and communication techniques. The tools that were developed out of this partnership then form the basis of this training, and from this training, we are producing climate communicators. So soon to include all of you on this webinar in that exciting group. We've done a lot of work to show that the tools that we use are effective. So we do a lot of evaluation. I think at the end, there'll be a little survey if you guys are willing to fill that out, because that helps us understand whether presentations like this one are achieving the goals that we think that it does. And some of the things that we're really thinking about here are we able to impart a sense of hope and understanding of solutions? Are we empowering people to act and increase the likelihood of acting about climate change, and also improving understanding of what explains climate change? And so the tools that I'm going to present to you in a moment, those are the outcomes that we expect your improved communication will yield. Okay, so I know that's a kind of lot of lofty goals, ranging from your communications will be able to do a number of different things, and that we're trying to push these skills out at a national scale. But so where do we start today? So the place that we actually start is within our own brains, and a really critical element of climate communication is understanding how people think about climate change so that we can construct messages that are actually going to deliver high impact and effectively navigate the ways that we think, instead of fighting against them and ending up with messages that are hitting these kind of roadblocks or leading into these really unproductive directions that we sometimes encounter. So this slide shows results of a Google search just for ocean. And I'm going to pause for a moment and let this soak in. So please, to yourself, think about what you notice about these images. What types of feelings do they evoke? Great. So I'm seeing a couple of responses in the chat box, and I'm sure many of you are just thinking in your head, yeah, we're seeing some things, peace, it's beautiful, pleasure, strength, really blue. And so this starts to capture that we often have these kind of shared ideas about particular concepts. So when we think of something like the ocean, we often think big, it's blue, it's beautiful, maybe it's powerful. This is what we call, to some extent, a shared mental model. There's these thoughts and ideas that tend to go together with this particular concept. And this is actually a really kind of profound idea, is that the way our brains work, we tend to group some sets of ideas together. And in many cases, there are actually sets of ideas that are fairly consistent across a culture. And so we will call these kind of colloquially cultural models, with the idea that we can use that as a shorthand to group some of these sets of ideas. And understanding where they exist is really critical to help us either tap into them or avoid them if we know that they're not helpful. So obviously the ocean's involved in climate change, but we want to narrow in a little bit to cultural and mental models that are specific to climate change. And so these two cartoons, I think, illustrate some concepts and some mental models that we might experience either ourselves or when talking with others about climate change. So the first I always think is really funny, is why don't the greenhouse gases escape through the hole in the ozone layer? And so the mental model here that this is referencing is that when we think about the atmosphere, we tend to think about all of those gases and these processes as singular. So there's a lot of confusion among the American public about climate change and the ozone hole. Those concepts often get conflated together with people actually thinking that they're part of the same process instead of two different atmospheric processes. And this is really critical because if you don't know what the problem is, so carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, the types of solutions that you think are reasonable for it aren't going to be aligned to the problem. And then the second cartoon says, my desire to be well informed is currently at odds with my desire to remain sane. And this is tapping into this kind of cultural and mental model we may have around climate change, which is that it's this kind of black hole of despair and there's nothing to be done about it, and we're feeling kind of trapped just by the enormity of the problem, and this thinking that, okay, well, I'm just one person, I can't do anything about this, so I'm not gonna engage. So that's a flavor of kind of two of these mental models. And if you're thinking, okay, that's great, but why do we care about knowing what these mental models are? This is actually a really useful tool to either tap into or avoid them. So one example I like to give to illustrate how powerful and flexible these models are is actually to think about something like beach access. And we can often hold kind of contradictory mental models, and so activating one versus another can lead us in different directions. So we're talking about beach access, and I start by telling you, how do you feel about trespassing? You may say, oh yeah, trespassing isn't good. Oh, beach access, you should probably there's probably some property rights involved in that. And that's going to influence how you come into the conversation about beach access. If instead I start the conversation and say, the ocean and beaches are a public resource that all of us share, how do you feel about beach access? You're probably going to feel a little bit less amenable to some of those lines in the sand saying you can't cross it. And so it's that fundamental thinking about which approach are we queuing up that is really critical here. There are some kind of frames and directions of what we're queuing up that are more productive than others. So this slide is a summary of some of these mental models, and this is available, I guess, both on this recording once it goes up and also on our website if you want to look at it. But the things to highlight here is there's a huge array of these different types of models in climate change thinking, and we've grouped them into these different categories, and then they're color-coded by green, as this tends to lead to productive conversations. So again, when we say productive, this means civic-oriented, solutions-oriented, and hopeful. Yellow means it can go either way. So you can direct the conversation in positive directions, or it could go off the rails. And red means it's tending to tap in to these negative, unproductive mental models that are not leading us towards action and engagement. So I'm trying to pick which one to go through. I'll pick science because that's my background. So one thing that really tends to resonate with the American public is that we're innovators and that science is innovative. And so starting with a frame talking about science as innovative and helping us to learn more about the world using creative and clever techniques, that tends to lead us in a productive conversation, versus if we're talking about something like my observation is as good as yours, this tends to spark kind of doubt and, well, I didn't see warm temperatures yesterday, therefore this isn't happening. My favorite example of this is, bringing a snowball into the house floor is a great example of, if I saw snow, climate change can't be happening. But that does really tend to derail communications towards an unhelpful place when we cue that up. And so you can see in a lot of these topics, there are both positive and negative directions to these framing elements. And we overall are hoping to avoid some of those red ones and steer towards some of the green ones. And you'll note too, I know that I had talked about those two those cartoons earlier, and you can see it's under climate change, so center, bottom. I know this slide's a little terrifying. Big, scary, depressing is one of those frames that tends to be unhelpful, versus a call to action, something needs to be done. It's all about ozone, isn't it? Is also in that unhelpful frame that tends to lead conversations a little bit astray. Okay, so overall, our goal with strategic framing is to try to use these and other tools to steer conversations in positive directions. So one of our goals is to bridge the gap between what scientists understand as knowledge and public understanding, because there's often a big gap there that we as scientists are not particularly good at communicating. Really help the public understand the mechanisms of climate change, to show both you and then whoever you're conversing with that they can be heroes of their own climate change story. So I was really excited when I was invited to this and I saw that it was climate champions. That really resonated with how we talk about this. And then also leaving both you and your conversant with a sense of hope at the end of your conversation. So these three kind of core elements are what we're going to walk through in terms of providing tools for how to think through this. So first is kind of establishing value. How does this matter to society? Then we'll talk about that piece of how does climate change work and how to communicate that. And then finally, how to communicate about how to improve the situation. And after each of these kind of sessions, I will take a pause to see if there are any questions about that in particular. Okay, so diving into the first part, the first critical part of our climate change story and conversation is, why does this matter, both to society and to the person you're talking with? And here, we're trying to establish basically a shared mental model of why we should engage in this conversation. And our partners at the organization called Frameworks has done extensive testing to look at what values resonate across the United States, so that you can choose something that is likely to resonate. If you know the person with whom you're speaking, you can often tailor that a little bit better than this kind of average. But we do recommend using these tested values and making sure you do always start with that value, because that's your common ground. And it's really easy to assume that someone cares about the same things that you do and for the same reasons. So establishing that from the outset is really critical. So the two values that we recommend using are protection and responsible management. And I'm going to walk through each of them. So protection is an articulation of X, something matters because we have a duty to safeguard the well-being of people and places. So some of the ideas that are part of this is that we must protect and preserve the habitats and ecosystems that we depend on. So we're establishing this relationship between some of our natural resources and ourselves, and evoking this sense of we have a responsibility or duty to have that protection as a part of our actions. It also invokes this idea of kind of caring, and that showing concerns for others is the right thing to do. Stepping in to ensure other people's safety and well-being. Again, this is a value we tend to share. This can also often extend to future generations. So say we're protecting these resources and ecosystems for future generations is a nice way to extend that. And then tapping into this idea that protection means taking measures to eliminate or reduce risk. So you might also see that taking place as, we need to be vigilant in shielding people and places from harm. So this is a kind of family of ways to talk about protection as a value that tends to be shared among Americans. Our second value is responsible management. And if you're thinking that sounds really similar, it is pretty similar. But it's a slightly different flavor. And again, both of these in testing with, I think, almost 5,000 individuals across the United States have shown that these are really resonant and that they are most likely to produce outcomes that are leading conversations to action, engagement, and understanding of climate. So some of the other frames or values that we tested against were scientific consensus. That does not tend to work very well. So arguing that we should trust scientists does not work nearly as well as the value of responsible management or protection. So this value is really queuing up the idea that we need to be taking common sense steps today in the interests of future generations. So really, really queuing up that forward-looking, kind of take these baby steps to get us to an outcome that we want. So we have a responsibility for the environment. We need to look ahead and handle the problem before it gets worse. Responsible managers look to evidence, and they take a level-headed step-by-step approach, and that future generations are really depending on the decisions we make today. So you can sometimes use the future-looking element for future generations and protection, but this value, that's really the core of it, is that forward-looking. We need to be taking these reasonable steps over time to safeguard future generations. So I'm gonna pause for a moment and let you guys read. Here are two examples, and I've inserted your community here on this about how you might use these values when starting a conversation. Okay. So this is one of my kind of natural pause points. So this has covered a little bit of just these values and those elements that we want to queue up first. Looking in the chat, it doesn't look like we have any questions, but I'll take another very quick pause if there are initial questions about this component. And again, there's also an opportunity at the end to ask questions. So you're not going to miss out on question asking if you don't type very quickly now, but I'll wait a couple more seconds before we go to the how does it work component.
The only question I saw was, where's the plastic island? And that was during the ocean photos, but I think it was kind of a joke.
I will say that that's one of the things I hear most from a lot of our folks in the network is that conflation between plastic pollution and climate change is one of the major areas of confusion right now. And, those are pretty distinct issues in a lot of ways. So I know that seeing the ocean, which does have a lot of plastic in it, that is a reasonable question, but we'll flag that. Okay, and then Cindy, your question about a specific solution, I'm gonna put off answering that for the moment because I think when we get to the full pieces of the story that will help you get there. I think in short, yes, this type of value will help you get to that with idling cars as a solution as an end. And then Dominic, yeah, I mean, so Dominic's question is, whether this approach is tailored towards kind of contrary individuals. So this is something we do think about a lot, and some of the research does show that there's a small minority of people who are kind of so pitted against thinking about climate and engaging with this that a lot of effort and conversation towards those individuals is unlikely to be successful. Again, this tends to be a pretty small group, I think around maybe 10%. So the majority of people you're going to talk to are going to have some level of flexibility and willingness to engage with these types of framings. And these values have been tested on a wide range of the American public. The samples that were done were purposely intended to be across the political spectrum in different areas of the country. So in general, those values are a pretty good, safe bet for engaging with folks, even if you think they might be a little bit contrary or a little bit not engaged yet with climate as an important issue. So I would encourage you to try these values. I both anecdotally can vouch for having some conversations that I was really convinced were going to go in an unproductive direction that turned out great, and that our research, which has been used extensively across the country using these tools, also shows that tends to work. Okay. Great. So I'm going to move on to talking about the how it works component, which is a really critical kind of second part of our story. So we've established here's some high level values that we likely share to think about why we should be having this conversation at all. And then we want to really start with what is climate change. And so I know you guys have gone through this really great curriculum and talking about what climate change is and talking about some of that science. But the reality is that even for folks who are somewhat interested and think climate change is an issue, they often don't actually know how it works. And a huge amount of our research shows that understanding the mechanism for climate change is one of the best predictors for supportive action on climate change. And even more critically, that if people don't understand the mechanism of how climate change works, they're likely to arrive at the wrong solutions for how to fix it. So, I think a great example is if you're only focused on the impacts of climate change, you might say, okay, well, cleaning up the plastic in the Pacific is going to help that. It's a separate problem. Not saying that's not a great idea, not a thing we should focus on, but that's not going to be fixing climate change. So we know that it's really, really critical to talk through that mechanism. And I will say as well, I know a lot of my colleagues who work in areas where climate change is a taboo and polarizing word will use these tools to talk through the mechanism without ever saying climate change really, really effectively, because they can link then human actions to the endpoints that we care about, pulling in those values that are shared, and then talking about solutions, completely kind of bypassing that tricky climate change word in some cases. So the good explanations that we want to use in talking about climate change are to use something that's kind of sticky that we're going to remember, that really help clarify these mechanisms, and that are making clear linkages from one concept to another. And we also want to ensure that people see a role for themselves in the story, because otherwise there's no action. There's nothing to do later. It's just some problem that someone else has created. So Sally, thank you. That was a great segue question from the chat for an example. So we recommend a number of explanatory metaphors to help with this. And these have also been tested on the American public to make sure that they do have these properties in terms of being understandable and sticky. So I'm going to talk about the first two today, but there's more information on the other two on our website. And if during the Q&A you guys want to ask about them, I'm happy to talk about them as well. So the first one is what we call the heat trapping blanket. And this is essentially the kind of story you tell to fill the cognitive hole of how does climate change actually work. It is, I would say, a replacement for, if you've heard of the kind of greenhouse gas metaphor. It's a replacement for that because the American public doesn't tend to actually know how greenhouse works and associates that positively. So the metaphor works as such. The atmosphere acts like a blanket around the Earth, keeping in heat that would normally escape to space. When we burn fossil fuels like coal, oil, and natural gas, we're adding carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, which is thickening that blanket, and this thicker blanket traps more heat. So the critical components of this are that we've talked about the mechanism. So carbon dioxide is acting like a blanket, keeping in heat. People really know how blankets work, so that works well. We've linked humans are a part of the story. So we've talked about when we burn fossil fuels like coal, oil, and natural gas, we're adding carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, which is like thickening the blanket. And then we've established that that thicker blanket traps more heat. So we've really gone in this nice, neat, stepwise fashion, explaining the cause, our actions, to this atmospheric effect. And our research has shown that this metaphor is much more effective than using anything referencing a greenhouse. It's very sticky, so it's like unlikely to change. If you say this to one person, they're likely to be able to faithfully reproduce it over multiple conversations. And we have also shown through these studies that using this metaphor relative to other metaphors are much more likely to have those conversations go in this kind of positive, solutions-oriented, and hopeful way. So our next metaphor that we use is called regular versus rampant. And this is really addressing the issue that carbon dioxide is also a natural chemical that we encounter and that we may have positive connotations with, as that's part of life. And that's in fact something that is in our lungs sometimes. So we're really distinguishing between these regular and rampant levels of carbon dioxide. And so the idea here is to distinguish between regular levels that are used and created by normal life processes, so photosynthesis and respiration, and rampant levels of carbon dioxide that are coming from burning fossil fuels for energy. So that's really the whole story. I've made these slides because I was excited about pulling in some IPCC numbers. But so the normal regular carbon dioxide is naturally cycled by plants and animals. Rampant levels of carbon dioxide are caused by burning fossil fuels like coal, oil, and natural gas. And so, if you want to get into the kind of technical, this is where we're talking about these normal processes which were balanced, then get unbalanced by this burning of fossil fuels. So here is an example of some of these metaphors and explanations in action. I'm going to be quiet for a moment and let you guys read through and either in the chat or think to yourself, what are the kind of critical elements in this communication that are leading to it being effective and in using some of the tools we just discussed. Okay, so I've highlighted here some of the elements to draw your attention to. So we started with that cause. We use the heat trapping blanket to explain how climate change works. We're really connecting the dots and talking about how this process leads to other downstream effects. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a moment. And we've also talked about what's at stake. So we've then linked this to issues that are relevant, whether that's some of the local fauna or whether that's human elements like local infrastructure. Pairing this type of story with a value like protection is a really great way to really link that. So we're talking about, okay, we need to protect these resources that we share, like these elephant seals and like this infrastructure that we rely on. Okay, so I know I kind of highlighted a little bit already this other concept we're going to talk about, which I think is the other just really critical element of the toolkit. The explanatory metaphors are really great as individual tools, but obviously you don't have a prepackaged metaphor for every single thing you want to talk about. So explanatory chains are the other really critical element here. And they're kind of deceptively simple. Really, the idea is you start with an initial factor, you talk about a median factor, and then there's a final consequence. So it's really building these little chains of X leads to Y, leads to Z, leads to, I guess, background to A. I say deceptively simple because I have found in a lot of my communications, if there's something you're familiar with, it's really easy to kind of skip a step and say, yeah, obviously you know how this happens. But it's really critical when we're talking to others to make sure we're not skipping those steps. So I've given some examples here that are some of the, I think, kind of trickier ones that it's really tempting to hand wave around. One of those, I think, is extreme weather. So when we're talking about extreme weather and climate change, it's really tempting to say, like, oh yeah, obviously climate change causes extreme weather. But to really walk it through, in this case, I've said, okay, initial factor, we really need to start with humans and emitting climate change, or emitting carbon dioxide as that starting factor, the heat trapping blanket, and then our mediating factor. So in this case, I'm trying to get to wildfires as our extreme event. So I would say warming air boosts evaporation, which can worsen drought. More drought creates dry fields and forests, which are prone to catching fire. And then our outcome is that we expect longer wildfire seasons. So again, really simple, just creating a link between the initial cause of climate change and longer wildfire seasons in this case. I also find that in a lot of cases when we're talking about impacts to species, there's often a number of links that we need to get to really spell out, okay, well, why are they impacted by climate change? So again, here I started with our heat trapping blanket metaphor. I have a number of mediating factors. So saying, okay, well, where does that heat go? A lot of it goes into the ocean. Many ocean creatures, like lobsters, actually are relying on the temperature of the ocean to thermoregulate themselves. And this influences things like disease, their metabolism, their reproductive success, oxygen flow. It really helps them regulate everything about their life, basically. And then we can say, okay, well, when temperatures are too low, that can be damaging. Or when they're too high, that can be damaging. And we actually know that too high of temperatures are particularly damaging because they have increased metabolism and less oxygen in the water. So those temperatures are particularly dangerous for them. And then given that we know that our ocean has a lot more heat, we can say, okay, lobster populations, full disclosure, I originally wrote this about Gulf of Maine lobster populations. I know that a lot of the lobsters off of the West Coast, I think, are heading farther offshore as their main response. But again, this is walking us through a lot of these impacts.
You can substitute in crabs.
Okay, great. Okay, so this is another pause point. I'm going to read through some of the chat briefly to see if there are points of clarification, and also pause for a couple more seconds if folks want to add some more clarifying questions in the chat. There was a question about, can we use some of the specific wording in a brochure to be given out locally? I think in general, yes. I believe I have highlighted in quotes where I've taken that text directly from a different source. But feel free to shoot me an email as well if you have specific questions about that. But I think in general, you should be fine. Okay, So then the last critical element of our story is, how do we improve the situation? So we've talked about why we should be talking about this at all and our common ground for what we care about. We've talked about how the climate elements actually work and how to link to what we're talking about. And then we'll finally talk about how we improve the situation. And Dominic, I do see your comment. I will get to that, I think, once we go through this narrative at the end. But thanks for flagging. Okay, so the critical piece that we need to make sure we end with is actually, well, what do we do about it? If we leave a conversation with just, here's the outcome, we're kind of left with a bit of a cliffhanger. We don't know how to engage, and we don't know what comes next. And there's, so so first of all, it's just important to have a solution. That's what we end on. But there's another really critical element, which is the solution needs to match the problem. And it's really easy, especially with climate change, to have this kind of mismatch and say, okay, well, you know, we've established that we have these emissions that are creating a heat trapping blanket that are making our entire planet warming. Turn off your lights. Like, that doesn't feel like that's going to solve the problem. We have this mismatch of the scale of the problem and the scale of the solution don't match. Similarly, if we just say, okay, there's this big problem, that's overwhelming. And so our research shows that the critical sweet spot is talking about solutions at the community level. So typically at the scales that you guys are thinking about. So at a town or township level, maybe at the state level, or in some cases at a national level. So talking about things like increasing bike lanes, increasing energy efficiency in the region, increasing the renewable energies in the grid. All of these types of solutions are appropriate for the scale of the problem we're actually talking about. And of course, these can also be depending on who you're talking with. I know a lot of our groups that are involved in schools have focused on solutions that are for the school, which it tends to be really appropriate for children who are thinking about these ideas, because that's the natural scale of the community that they're thinking about. So that's really critical to make sure that we have the right size solution that we're talking about. And we find that approaching this as this kind of collective level, here's what we can do about it, fosters this sense of hope. There's something that we can do and engage with it. And that this collective level action also tends to lead to these kind of step-by-step informed, engaged approaches that align well with those protection and responsible management values that I talked about earlier. We find that it's most effective when you can talk specifically about programs, initiatives, or approaches that are happening locally. So if I say something like more bike lanes, sure, it's much more effective if you can say, hey, the city of Shoreline is really considering putting some new bike lanes on our major roads, you know, specifically this one and this one, and we think this is really going to have an impact in reducing the amount of car traffic and need for folks to commute by car. That's a much more effective solution to present than just the general one, if you have that available. So I think I gave some examples of these solutions. One other that I would like to highlight as well is that talking about climate change is actually a kind of solution in and of itself. There is a huge amount of research that shows that talking with each other tends to build the type of community that we need to actually do this collective action, and also is building the kind of hope and support that we need to kind of continue this long journey to think through and act on climate. So in many cases too, your solution can be, okay, let's continue, let's bring others into this conversation and talk about climate, why we think it's important and what we can do about it. So that's just another solution to have in your toolkit, and I find is often a good one to combine with other solutions, because you can say, okay, well, let's bring other people into this conversation to figure out how we get to that collective level solution. I do want to offer one note of caution, which is in our swamp, that slide with a lot of text with the green, yellow, red. One of the issues there to avoid is steering conversations into polarized territory. So talking about, okay, this is really a political issue, there are two camps. That tends to have conversations and unproductively. And in how you queue up solutions, you can actually trigger that type of polarized thinking. So we find that the language of how you talk about community level solutions is really critical. The words like politicians, policies, laws, regulations, and government tend to queue up that type of polarized thinking versus civic leaders, approaches, programs, talking about the name of whatever place, so saying shoreline, or this municipality, tend to not queue up that type of divisive thinking. And again, queuing back to these values that we share can be a really great way to reinforce that message. Okay, so I've given another example here to read through. I'm again gonna take a pause and let you guys read through and think through what are some of the critical framing elements and things that you see here. So please take a moment to read this. Okay. And I guess I should have mentioned that I think this solutions and action piece is meant to be a bit of a follow-on to that last piece we read, talking about seals. I realized at the end, otherwise that reference to seals is a bit out of the blue. So some of the things that we've highlighted here are, again, queuing up this value, making it clear how these different solutions are reducing carbon dioxide. It can often be helpful to talk about co-benefits or other things that are relevant in terms of those values we talked about and how this solution enriches that. There's a specific example of a program and how it's worked. And there's also this invitation to talk with others about this. So we've talked about many of the things on this chart. So I think I'll take this moment, Dominic, and answer your question about ocean acidification. So the metaphor that we recommend for ocean acidification is called osteoporosis of the sea. And the way that we talk about this, so again, we start with this human element. And so when we burn fossil fuels like coal, oil, and natural gas, we emit carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Much of that carbon dioxide is actually absorbed by the ocean. In the ocean, carbon dioxide reacts with water to produce chemicals that tend to weaken the shells of organisms, much like osteoporosis acts on bones. Similar to how we treat osteoporosis, it's important to take preventative, responsible action to help prevent this damage. Often in those conversations, we'll have elements of talking about how these weakened shells are brittle and thinner. So the osteoporosis component is really apt right there. I would say the other element that's really critical for that is this idea of queuing up, that we know that for human medicine, it's really critical to take these early, responsible, preventative steps. And so queuing up that metaphor tends to be really effective for that as well. Okay, wow, see, we have a lot of questions coming in. Yeah, so I think we can really dive into questions. now, and I guess I'll just put up here that we do have a website that has a number of resources, both a bunch of the content that I've described here, as well as some blog posts and examples. So while we do questions, I'll put this up so you know where to find some additional information. Okay. So Cindy, I'm looking at your question on any ideas on goals regarding talking to others. What would be the best case scenario for all of us on this call to take action? Not totally sure I understand what that means. I mean, for me personally, the kind of guiding principles that I like to keep in the back of my mind with respect to where we need to get to is that if we're thinking about the Paris Accord agreement, so aiming for 1.5 degrees maximum warming, at the worst 2 degrees warming globally, the degree of change that we need to be doing is essentially net zero by 2050, and net sequestration thereafter. And so essentially it works out to roughly we need about 50% decrease in overall emissions by 2030, and then again net zero around 2050, which that's kind of my guiding star when thinking about the overall magnitude of the changes we need to be making. With respect to specific sectors, you know, it's the emissions per sector does vary a lot, but I think the way you can kind of get around that is we need everything to essentially get to that net zero, which I think actually does simplify a lot about how you're thinking about it. It's not some fundamental, okay, this part of the economy or this part of the world gets to keep some emissions. It's really everything needs to be marching down at a pretty substantive rate. And please let me know if that didn't answer your question at all. That was my interpretation of it. Okay, so Declan, your question about how do you frame talking about individual actions? Yeah, in general, I actually avoid talking about individual actions. There is some evidence actually that talking about individual actions and engagement with individual small scale actions can actually erode support for larger policy actions, because there's some sense, I think the theory is that you can kind of feel like you're already doing your part. So you can in some cases kind of fill up a capacity to some extent of how you're queuing up in those conversations. Yeah, I've done my part. I don't need to support national climate policy. So when I'm having conversations, I avoid individual actions. I think that in the kind of grand scheme of how we're thinking about this, it is important for us to do some of those individual actions, but it has to be in concert with these community level solutions, and it cannot be at the cost of community level solutions. So making sure that those community level solutions are front and center is so critical. And so in terms of communicating that larger worldwide solutions are necessary to solve climate change, we have found that setting up that as an issue tends to come fairly directly by talking about what actually is causing climate change. So when we're burning fossil fuels like coal, oil, and natural gas, when we use it for things like electricity and transportation, in general, people get the message that, oh, that's pretty much everything that we use. That's really, really big, and we're going to need big action to tackle that. And the solutions that people start to come up with in general after understanding and hearing explanations for the heat trapping blanket tends to be at the scale of, oh, we need to shift away from things like cars. We need to find new solutions for transportation and how we electrify our homes. So I have found that communicating, actually we need big action on this, tends not to be the challenge when you use these types of values and metaphors to get you started. Sally, yes, there are examples of a lot of these resources, and in addition to a lot more explanations and examples on our website. We do also offer a number of additional trainings. As you can tell, I hope that I've glossed over some of these topics. There's a lot more detail that we can cover. There's a lot more nuance and additional practice that is really critical for this. So we do offer additional resources and trainings. Some of them are self-paced. You can watch and go through it online. We do also offer some trainings that are facilitated online. So they're 6-week courses that have, you know, real teachers on the other end of the computer. If you are really excited about learning more and engaging more, there are lots of ways to engage with us and learn more about communicating about climate change. And there's also, we have a wide number of folks across the country who are working on this, including a really active community in Washington State. Okay. So Cindy, suggestions on what we can do to help: talk to 5 people a day, talk to our social media followers. Yeah, both of those are great suggestions. I don't have specific numbers on, you know, what a good personal goal is with respect to these conversations. I think we have found that in many cases, one-on-one conversations do tend to be more effective. And that in some cases, when talking on social media, some of those messages I think can be harder to communicate effectively, but obviously you have a huge reach there, and that can be a really effective tool as well. So I think a piece of it is also tailored to what your interactions with people, what your audience on social media, and what you're talking about, I think really tailors that. You know, I think another thing in some of these cases to get involved is to work on some of these community level solutions, and figure out what the barriers are to getting them broken down. I have a colleague, I know that her goal was to talk to every elected official in her city about climate change. So she was just going and have a substantive conversation about climate change with them and how it affected them. So that was a really, I think, effective and high level goal that she had. So I think things like that can also be a really great way to link some of these ideas of making sure you're talking to people potentially in positions of power who might not have been exposed to some of these ideas. Okay, Stacy, your question about how to talk to elementary school children about climate change. That's a really great question. I should have started out this presentation by saying that most of these tools and communication techniques were geared towards adults. I know a number of my colleagues have used these tools to talk and work with teens as well, especially at zoos and aquariums. And a number of my colleagues as well do work with younger children. I believe the really critical elements for working with younger children is really making sure that you're focusing more on the solutions and hope than on the somewhat potentially overwhelming pieces of climate change. So I think some of these techniques can be used, but the emphasis should really be on that hope and engagement, so the children aren't overwhelmed. I do have some colleagues who work more extensively with elementary age children who would probably be able to give you way better advice. And there's a couple other organizations more on the formal education side who focus on that age group. So please feel free to reach out to me and I can try to rustle up either some of those contacts or information about elementary age children. Okay, Goldilocks example of just right dependent on each person, or do we really need to reach a concrete level of action? Yes, I would say the Goldilocks example of just right is more about the scale of the problem, in that we need to be talking about not individual scale solutions, but ones that are at a community level. But then on the other side, it's not helpful just to say, okay, well, we need to decarbonize the entire economy. It's like, well, that's not an action. That's not a thing we can get behind. So it's finding something kind of between those two endpoints that is pushing us forward. And I think the context that you're operating in is really what should determine, you know, what kind of level that you're working on. If you're working or talking with someone who's really involved in a school board, maybe the scale of the school is the appropriate community. If you're thinking about some type of renewable energy in the grid, it's probably a much wider area, because you're fundamentally talking about potentially a large service area that you're trying to shift. So, you know, the scale is a little bit bigger. I think the reality is we need action on all of these levels. So if you're pushing forward at one of those larger community scales, that is a step in the right direction. Okay, Declan, that's a great question about what are some good examples of mid-tier community level solutions. So I would say some examples that I've seen at a kind of smaller level are talking about things. And I would say that organization Mothers Out Front has a lot of really great examples of what they're actually working on, and that I find are often really motivating for what solutions might look like. But so shifting school buses to electric vehicles within a particular school district is an example. And you can talk about both the impact of those vehicles, and then also the co-benefits for children's health in terms of some of the fumes that come off those buses. Bike lanes are another thing that's great. So that, I would say often the examples that are more about reducing how hard it is to be green are really effective, because it's not necessarily like you as an individual need to keep throwing yourself against this mountain that's uphill. It's really, these solutions are about making that hill less steep and saying, okay, if you want to individually bike to work, that's really hard if there aren't bike lanes. And so if we're working together to make sure there are bike lanes to reduce that barrier, that can be really effective. So I often find that when I'm trying to brainstorm these, it's really helpful to think, okay, if I were going to do something as an individual, what are the things I might do? Okay, and then what's the community level version of that? And the community level version is often, what's the thing we could do together that would make this easy? So if I say I'm really into composting, or I really want to be composting, well, what's the barrier? Okay, I live in New York City. The barrier for me might be that there's no place for me to actually go put my compost. I have to walk really far to go deliver it to a farmer's market. This is a terrible example, actually, because we've recently introduced a policy where they're actually rolling out compost that you can happen in your building. But, you know, that's the kind of, okay, well, let's figure out how to work to get compost pick up across the city. Or, you know, if I say I really want to have my electricity grid be greener, okay, then I can think, okay, well, is that even available in my area? Do I need to work to figure out how we can create programs to have a different electricity mix even available where I am? So that's often how I brainstorm it, because I find that that's often a bit more concrete. Okay, Patricia, your question is, I understand corporations are responsible for the most carbon dioxide. What is the best way to address this? Yeah, that's a really great point. And you know, so one thing I would just caution in general is that I think anytime you see a number that says X is responsible for this percentage of emissions, if you added up all of those numbers, they would never add up to 100%, because they're often counting some things multiple times. So, you know, like corporations are responsible for the most carbon dioxide is a different way of grouping things than like buildings or industrial processes or transportation, because like a lot of transportation and a lot of buildings are corporations. So just one word of caution with some of that. But your point's totally reasonable that, you know, there are a lot of I don't want to say choices, but yeah, a lot of the, you know, the products that we buy and the way that we get them have very large amounts of embedded carbon dioxide from how they were produced, from how they were transported. I think there's a number of ways to approach that. In some cases, there are community level solutions in terms of lobbying companies directly and letting them know that their consumers really care about carbon dioxide. And I think there's examples of some companies responding to that. I just saw yesterday that Chipotle launched a food print tracker for your burritos that can tell you something about the carbon and water and soil health impacts of their products. And we have seen some other companies that have also taken actions at various levels and with differing levels of ambition and efficacy towards this. But, you know, I think there is a role in some cases for consumer attention and lobbying. I think legislation is in some cases a great solution. I think in some of these cases, the tricky thing is really the scale where you're talking about for that. I would say the other piece, you know, a huge component overall of, sorry, let me go back to the scale piece, because I think there's a difference if you have like a manufacturing plant nearby. Local regulations about what that plant can do are probably going to be way more effective than if that company doesn't exist near you at all. And if you're talking about a multinational company, you know, legislation across borders for countries starts to be important. So I think some of those questions start to, you know, it depends on which corporation and which ask you're really thinking about. Yeah, so I think overall it's a multifaceted and context dependent approach for how to approach corporations. Okay, so Mary Kate asked about the Kyoto Protocol and the emissions trading. Yeah, so the Kyoto Protocol had emissions trading primarily between kind of more developed nations who were supposed to be cutting emissions significantly and more low-income nations who actually, in many cases, need to increase their emissions in order to provide a reasonable quality of life and or food security to their people. So the idea was that there was a kind of limited set of kind of offset type thinking across these income levels for countries. Yeah, I don't think we have seen the level of monetary flow through that we wanted to, and I think in many of these cases that the country level commitments were at the level we wanted to see. I will caution that from how we talk with others about that, talking about different countries and in particular the level of ambition for these countries can be a little bit of a area that can lead conversations in an unproductive direction. In particular, because I think there was a sense of, okay, well, if we do something as the United States and China doesn't do it, that, you know, it's not going to have an effect. At this stage, you know, Europe and China have much higher ambition for climate than we do. But again, you can then kind of get into a free rider problem. So do be careful when talking about some of these across country impacts. I think the critical thing when talking about some of these really weedy issues in terms of, I think, development and equity and what development means in terms of emissions it's critical to step back to those values and talk about responsible management and protection. And that really helps to sidestep some of there's this other issue, we don't have to worry about it. Grounding in that shared value, I think, can really help in that context. Okay, I think I've answered all of the questions that I see. If I accidentally skipped your question, feel free to paste it again, or if there's other questions, please let me know. If not, I am happy to wrap up and hand it over to Autumn. I will, regardless of whether there are more questions, thank all of you for your attention and for the really thoughtful, excellent questions you've asked at the end. I really appreciate your attention and your evident enthusiasm as a community for tackling this really, really important issue. And I do hope that I and our network of NOKI can be a resource to all of you. And you're clearly already in one of the solutions phase, but even being here and talking about this and clearly thinking about these conversations that I can kind of tell some of you have queued up on some of these topics. So really, really excited to be here, and please don't be strangers and feel free to reach out with some of these questions. In cases where I'm not an expert, I'm happy to try to find someone to connect you with. Again, this is what we think is so important to change this national conversation on climate change, and I'm so excited to have all of you on board with helping us change this conversation to be one that is transforming us towards action and hope and really turning this ship around with respect to our action on climate. So again, thank you all so much for your attention, and I hope that your conversations in the future go well, and feel free to reach out if they do or they don't.
Thank you, Emily. That was wonderful. And thank you everyone for all your great questions. I'm really thrilled now to introduce Autumn Salamak. Autumn is the Environmental Services Coordinator with City of Shoreline. And so a lot of your fantastic programs, she's your go-to gal there at the city. She develops and coordinates implementation of the city's environmental sustainability and climate action programs. Autumn has 20 years of experience developing and implementing programs related to climate change, energy efficiency and conservation, waste reduction, water conservation, pollution prevention, low carbon transportation, green buildings, and habitat preservation for government agencies, nonprofits, and businesses. So I am passing it over to Autumn now to take the lead from here.
Thanks, Heather. Does everything look good on your end?
Sure does. Thank you.
Okay, great. Well, good evening. As Heather mentioned, I'm Autumn Salamak, and I work on our city climate change and environmental sustainability programs. And I wanted to conclude our 7-week Climate Champion series by sharing some information on what we've got planned in the coming year and some opportunities for you to put into practice some of what you've learned during the series. So we've talked about our Shoreline Climate Challenge quite a bit over the past few weeks and are very appreciative of everyone who has joined since June and helped us exceed our initial goals to sign up more than 300 households and reduce more than 150 tons of greenhouse gas emissions. While the challenge was set up to help educate residents about what actions can help fight climate change, as we just heard from Emily, taking individual action is just a piece of our climate solution puzzle, but it's not enough. We really need your support for community level solutions, many of which are big, bold solutions. As a reminder, the Climate Challenge platform does include local resources, information on utility company rebates, and an educational curriculum that can be used by local teachers and youth community groups to talk about climate change. I know we've had some success recently working with a local Girl Scout troop, and we can share a curriculum for grades 8 through 12 with free teacher videos as well. If you complete at least one action in the climate challenge before the end of the month, there's still time to receive a beautiful, sustainable Shoreline aluminum coffee thermos. And as a reminder, if you earn 5,000 points by the end of the month, you can also enter a raffle for a $100 gift card to local Chamber of Commerce businesses. While we met our goals for the end of October, the climate challenge will continue. So please do continue to use the challenge platform as a way to talk with each other and access great tips and resources from other Shoreline residents. Next year, we will be measuring our progress in meeting our climate action goals by updating our greenhouse gas emissions inventory for both the city as a municipality and for the community as a whole. So that analysis is going to look at where our greenhouse gas emissions are coming from in the community and how they've changed since 2009. From 2009 to 2012, we saw a 4% decrease in community emissions, but when we measured again in 2016, we only saw a 2% decrease from 2009 to 2016. As we heard from Emily, we need to be at net zero emissions by 2050. So our current goals are 50% reduction by 2030 and 80% by 2050, but there is a larger conversation taking place right now within King County about if we need to adjust that long-term goal, which seems likely. It also seems likely that we'll need to take pretty aggressive action moving forward, and that transportation will likely continue to be our biggest source of emissions, given that most of our home energy use is in Seattle City Light territory, which is considered a carbon neutral utility. Lots of opportunities coming up next year to talk about all of this because we will be updating our 2013 Climate Action Plan. So the city created a sustainability plan back in 2009, followed by our first Climate Action Plan in 2013. And that plan needs to be updated with the community to really prioritize actions, both reduce future greenhouse gas emissions and help prepare our community for current and future climate impacts, and to do so in a really equitable manner. This will be a great opportunity to really dive into what priority community level solutions we really want to target as a community in the next 5 to 10 years. We are planning to kick off that effort in mid-2021, and we'll be reaching out to those of you who have completed this full webinar series and are now designated as Shoreline Climate Champions to talk about all of that in more detail and how you can really play a role in the Climate Action Plan. So stay tuned. We're very early stages right now. We're still waiting for the budget to get passed for next year, but more information will certainly be coming out about this. To assist us in updating our climate action plan, we'll be using the new King County Climate Action Toolkit. The toolkit was just released and was designed to help cities prioritize actionable and practical strategies to most effectively and quickly reduce community-wide greenhouse gas emissions. It was developed by the King County Cities Climate Collaboration, also known as the K4C, with input from myself and other staff from member cities. Through the K4C, King County and 17 partners, which you can see on the map here, are all collaborating to coordinate and enhance the effectiveness of local government climate and sustainability action. Shoreline was a founding member of the K4C back in 2011, and both Mayor Hall and I actively participate in regular discussions with all the partner jurisdictions to push for really strong continued regional climate action, to share best practices and leverage our resources to meet our countywide climate goals. As some of you heard during a previous session, we recently concluded a climate impacts and resiliency study to determine what climate change impacts were of most concern for the shoreline community, with really a focus on increased rainfall and localized flooding, extreme heat events, and impacts on human health and sea level rise. We're working to start implementing recommendations from the study and to use a new GIS tool to analyze capital projects at the city and identify opportunities to increase our resiliency to climate change. I also anticipate that our climate action plan update will include a focus to really hone in on what do we want to do in terms of climate resiliency beyond just looking at our city infrastructure. A somewhat related topic, we'll also be continuing a program called WasteWise that we started with Recology this year. The WasteWise program helps apartment and condo residents waste less and recycle right by providing free tools and resources for both the property manager and residents. When there are too many contaminants in the recycling bin, it needs to be disposed of as garbage, and commercial customers can start being charged a fee if that happens. So the WasteWise program really provides free waste consultations at large apartment and condo complexes with personalized reports that identify their top recycling contaminants, recycling signs and posters, technical assistance, reusable recycling totes for residents, and property-specific educational videos. Those videos highlight the types of contaminants found in their recycle bins with quick tips on how to recycle right. So far, we've run the program at one apartment complex, Ballinger Commons, which resulted in a 3% reduction in recycling contamination from August to September. And we have another 5 properties signed up in Shoreline that we'll be working with through next summer, thanks to some state grant funding. So if you live in a large apartment complex or condo and are interested in potentially having your property sign up for this, let me know. I'm already working on our 2020 annual sustainability report, which will be released in March or April of the next year. You may know that we shared our first sustainability report this spring, which highlighted projects and programs completed, along with metrics tracking our progress to goals we've set for fighting climate change, reducing waste, expanding bicycle trails, and more. So stay tuned for an update of all that we were able to accomplish with the community despite a difficult year. I also wanted to let you know that the city offers environmental mini grants up to $5,000 to individuals, community groups, and business owners for projects that enhance the environment and promote environmental stewardship in the community. Those projects must occur in areas deemed for public use, provide a tangible and measurable benefit to the environment and the community, and address one of the focus areas noted on the slide. Matching funds or volunteer hours are required for at least 20% of your grant request, and grants are typically provided on a reimbursement basis, which means that you have to pay for the work and then submit a report and your receipts, and then the city will reimburse you. In 2020, we funded 4 projects in the Environmental Mini Grant Program, and I know I saw at least 2 names of our grantees on tonight's call. So I'll walk through those. The first was a total of 10 fifth grade classes at Highland Terrace and Echo Lake Elementary School are receiving remote lessons on ecosystem and climate change concepts and environmental stewardship. Our community group, Climate Action Shoreline, printed additional copies of their Working Together Every Day to Make a Change educational brochure for safe distribution to community members, and created promotional materials for volunteer use at future public events. We can have those again. Goat herds from Earthcraft Services were employed by Diggin' Shoreline to suppress invasive species plant growth in an area planned for a future Midvale community garden. And a new piece of art was created at Paramount School Park in partnership with the surrounding community to educate and inspire park visitors about the need to protect native habitat. For more information about what types of projects have been funded in the past, you can visit the city website, and we will share that tomorrow as well. The city also offers up to $2,000 for shoreline home or business owners to install a rain garden or native vegetation landscaping on their property. These features can help water soak into the soil faster, beautify a landscape area, filter out pollutants, and reduce flooding on your property. You can learn more about the Soak It Up rebate program at shorelinewa.gov/soakitup. You can also help reduce flooding and pollution in your neighborhood by volunteering to monitor storm drains and keep them clear of leaves and debris this winter. The Adopt a Drain program is a partnership between the city and its residents to care for our 7,000 plus storm drains by keeping the opening to those drains free from debris. Volunteers help monitor and remove leaves during the storm season, which runs from October to March. And by joining the Adopt a Drain program, you can help prevent localized flooding and improve water quality in local streams, lakes, and Puget Sound. Additional volunteer opportunities have been a bit sidelined this year due to the pandemic, but there are typically volunteer opportunities for park restoration efforts, community gardening, and the Green Shoreline Partnership, which is working to create a sustainable network of healthy forested parks and natural areas in Shoreline. You can also volunteer with your neighborhood association to create a sense of community, implement neighborhood mini grant projects, plan speakers on relevant topics, and share information that you've learned as a climate champion. You can always see what volunteer opportunities are available on our city website. If you're looking for immediate opportunities to keep learning, we do have 2 events planned in November that may be of interest. The first is an upcoming recycling workshop with Recology staff on November 5th. In this free 1-hour session, you'll learn which materials are accepted in your blue recycling bin, how to properly prepare those materials for recycling, how to properly dispose of items we're seeing a lot of these days, like cleaning wipes, masks, and disposable utensils, which, spoiler alert, all go into the trash. And you'll learn why proper sorting and preparation of your recyclables is so important. The second upcoming event is a free virtual viewing of the documentary, The Story of Plastic. This 2020 film takes a sweeping look at the man-made crisis of plastic pollution and the worldwide effect it has on the health of our planet and our people. Participants will receive the link to view the film on their own up to 3 days prior to the event. Then on Saturday, November 14th, from 11 a.m. to noon, we'll have experts from Zero Waste Washington, Recology, and the city debrief key themes from the film and discuss how we can address the plastic waste crisis and work towards a waste-free world. You can learn more about all of our city's sustainability and climate change programs on our website or by sending me an email anytime. And we'll include links for all the referenced programs and upcoming events in the post-webinar email. Really appreciate so many of you attending all 7 weeks of the Climate Champion series. And even if you just attended today for the first time or only attended a couple, we were just so appreciative to have such a great turnout and such a great community conversation on this topic. And I want to give a big thank you to Emily as well for doing such a great job on the presentation. We originally planned to host this entire series in person, which obviously we weren't able to do. But a silver lining to that is that we were able to then pull in people like Emily from the East Coast, people who are willing to stay up really late to be a part of this conversation with us. So really appreciate all of the great participation from folks, the great conversations and questions that have come through, and wanted to reiterate, feel free to reach out to me anytime, and stay tuned for more information about what's going to happen with our climate action plan and our next emissions inventory. Still all a little bit in development right now, but early next year, we should start seeing information come out about that.
Thank you, Autumn. There's a quick question here. How long will the Shoreline Climate Challenge continue?
Right now, it will continue at least through March. And then we will make a determination about if we continue it after that or not. But it is a great resource if you want to understand, why does your food choice and food systems in general, why are fruits and vegetables better for reducing climate impacts compared to things like beef and lamb? There's really great information within the platform to help you educate you about that.
Awesome. And another question, how long will the recorded sessions be up so I can tell others about it too?
I don't think we have any set takedown time for those. So I would say at least through the end of the year.
Great. And will there be another Climate Champion series? This is my first event.
To be determined. Like I said, we're just waiting for our 2021-2022 budget to get passed, and then we'll be able to start planning a little bit more solidly. However, you can go back and see all but one of the previous Climate Champion recorded webinars on the website.
And let's see, shout out to Robert here. I'm inspired to revise our lot plan for better water use and plants. That's awesome. Is Shoreline going to up the goals for participants in the Shoreline Climate Challenge?
Yeah, I think we will. We ran it sort of as an initial, 6-month challenge. But now that we've had a really great turnout, I think it's very likely that we will. We normally do a big in-person Earth Day event that will not be happening next year. So we're looking at how we can utilize the climate challenge to perhaps create some more remote opportunities for folks. So yes, stay tuned. And please do, if you haven't signed up yet, please do still sign up for the climate challenge and you can still take action.
Fantastic. And I just want to reiterate what Autumn said, and also Patricia, thank you, Emily, again for joining us and making it a late night. And Autumn, and to you and Cameron, keep up the great work at City of Shoreline. All you folks that live there are really lucky. It's such a terrific community. So I think that without further ado, I'm going to stop the recording. If there's any other questions,